Hey folks, today I'll be reviewing Furi. This is an in-depth review focused on game design and mechanics, so I recommend completing the game first prior to watching this video. Furi was released in 2016 for the PC and PS4 platforms. It combines the mechanics of twin-stick bullet hell shooters with an old-school beat-em-up, structured in a boss rush format. The fast-paced mechanics are paired with a punishing difficulty that continuously pushes players to their limits. This steep challenge stems from the fact that the team behind Furi, the Game Bakers, explicitly targeted hardcore gamers and speedrunners as their audience. This makes it unsurprising that Furi eschews traditional modal difficulty settings, however its inclusion of experience selection is noteworthy. The Promenade selection allows more casual players to experience the game's narrative in full by watering down the game's challenge. The difference with an easy mode is subtle but critical. In contrast with a modal difficulty setting, Promenade removes any expectation for compelling gameplay. This enables the development team to target the more casual audience without dedicating resources to it. The Furier selection offers the same experience in reverse, catering to ultra fans looking for an extra, if unbalanced, challenge. One key difference is that Furier is gated behind a single game completion. Here we see an interesting trade-off for the developer. Allowing anyone to pick Furier ensures that at least some people will pick it, fail to complete the game, and unfairly view the title as unbalanced. It's noteworthy that players often prefer to quit and criticize a game rather than lower the difficulty. The downside is that truly passionate players, particularly those with an interest in bullet hell titles, have no choice but to complete the game first on the default selection. Viewing this decision through a lens of experience selection makes it easy to empathize with the choice that the team made. The default selection is the idea that they want to convey to the audience. It's not a difficulty setting, it's an experience setting. The Furier experience only makes sense given the context of the default selection, so it's gated behind a single completion of the game. A core difference between Furi and similar boss rush titles is the similarity between the player and his opponent. The developers wanted to avoid the traditional David and Goliath scenarios by designing bosses that were on the same level as the player. This lends itself to engagements with a real back and forth, a real sense of weight. You really feel like you're fighting the boss in Furi, rather than simply depleting its health bar. Combat is structured with a focus on technical execution and memorization of enemy attack patterns. These are refined through a series of failures until the player is eventually successful. This is a core philosophical difference with FromSoft's Souls series, where technical execution is far less important than good game understanding. I mention this not because Souls is a good point of comparison, but simply because Miyazaki is cited as an influence on the title. The focus on technical execution is softened by generous health and retry mechanics, ensuring players have sufficient opportunities to make mistakes and tank their way through difficult encounters. This allowed the development team to take creative risks and try ideas that may be unworkable or unbalanced. This is especially helped by the life regeneration mechanic, which ensures every phase of the boss can be fought at least twice before the entire fight is redone. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the health and retry mechanics are the single most well-designed features in the game. Generous enough that the developers could be innovative and risky in their design, yet stingy enough that a player can't move forward without learning the core concept a boss is trying to teach them. Here we can start to see the beginning of a theme in Furi, taking something simple and easy to forget, like a life system, and polishing it into something truly compelling. Aside from the core story mode, another emphasis of the development team was speedrunning. Furi offers a dedicated speedrunning mode with an in-game ladder. Speedrunning offers players an opportunity to examine the game from a new angle. Rather than view each fight as an avoidance of death, they're framed as a proactive effort to kill the boss as quickly as possible. The intimidation factor of bosses is substantially lessened when viewed from this perspective. The developers noted that they wanted players to feel like they're entering a boxing ring, but this intent comes into conflict with the desire for a sense of progression. Each boss teaches a new lesson, continually leaving an impression of struggle and overcoming the odds. This diminishes the sense of a boxer sparring with an equal, or at least it did for me. The shift in focus offered by speedrunning, however, offsets this in subsequent playthroughs. The use of RNG also becomes more obvious when the player is attempting to speedrun the game. Furi's inclusion of RNG feels finely tuned, likely a result of the intentional targeting of speedrunners by the development team. There's a tricky balance to strike here. Too little RNG and the run becomes overly mechanical and frustrating. Too much and the experience feels random and unfair. Furi's approach is well considered. On a small scale, it randomizes boss attacks but ensures each attack is comparably punishable. The more substantial randomized sections, such as the spawning position of the burst, feel almost predictable in their execution. In fact, I would guess that there is a way to successfully predict her next location. This almost random inclusion is a type of thing communities are built on, places where people can work together to go in depth and study the game. It's complicated enough to warrant investigation, but not so complicated that nobody would bother. In other words, it's well-balanced RNG. It would be difficult to talk about Furi in depth without mentioning its sound design. Furi follows the trend of many recent independent games in making sound design a first-class feature rather than an afterthought. This is interesting given the need for the sound to balance well against the frenetic and frantic combat. It's noteworthy that comparable titles like Titan Souls simply don't work without their backing tracks, whereas Furi is a passable experience when played on mute. The sound was heavily designed to complement core gameplay rather than stand on its own. This becomes more obvious when looking at the sound design of the path segments. Without accompanying gameplay, the tracks are much stronger and more distinct, closely matching the surrounding environment. The attention-grabbing tones of the path shift into faster but more subdued tracks as the player tackles the boss. It's worth pointing out here that the backing tracks of the path only work when the player auto-moves. Manually walking through produces out-of-sync camera cuts and awkward turnabouts. I think the decision to offer any sort of manual movement in the path is the biggest design miss in Furi. The difference between automatic and manual walking is massive, particularly given the way changes in perspective tend to align with changes in the backing track. Automatic movement sets the player up mentally for the next fight, whereas manual movement puts focus simply on getting there. They're completely different experiences, and the latter simply doesn't belong in the game. Perhaps the clearest sign of solid design in this area is the strong memories that are evoked upon re-listening to a boss track. Backing tracks are timed against the beginning of the fight, meaning that restarting a boss will also restart the track from the very beginning. This repetition ensures every track becomes strongly associated with its respective boss fight. The song stands out to me as especially memorable, partly due to the strength of its path segment and partly due to the excellent backing track. On the one hand, I'm overjoyed to see sound design become more and more integral in game design. On the other hand, I worry about the exploitation of this trend to drive sales of overpriced original soundtracks accompanying poorly put together games. Sound producers for independent games like Carpenter Brute or Jake Kaufman have become independent figures in their own right, yet the beauty of their work would be easy to overlook if paired with a bad title. I think this is one of the more interesting trends to follow in the independent games market over the next few years. I'm especially interested to see the response to a bad game with a great track. Of course, while I think it's inevitable, it's definitely not something I'm looking forward to. The narrative in Furi is understated against the backdrop of the boss rush format, but excellent nonetheless. Furi adopts a disconnected narrative approach in which bits and pieces of the plot are provided and the player is given time to postulate what it all really means. I appreciated the thematic consistency with the rest of the game. The floating islands, teleporting rabbit, and widely varying bosses convey a sense of mysticism and wonder. It would be odd to pair this with a highly direct narrative. My personal favorite is the eventual twist identifying the player character as the likely villain in the overall story arc. Furi manages to hint at it enough that it doesn't feel like a cheap surprise, yet it was obscure enough that I definitely didn't guess at it until the final cutscene. The sudden dawning that the player character is an invader as he flies through a spaceship containing hundreds of identical riders is one of Furi's most memorable and satisfying moments. This leads into the game's final choice, deciding whether to assimilate the planet or attack the mothership. On balance, I like the way this was done because it directly reveals the story's premise through a choice offered to the player. However, I found attacking the mothership to be an immersion-breaking experience. Up until this point, Furi has adeptly hidden the truth of the world from the player. How can the player suddenly feel so confident attacking the mothership? It makes sense to the player, having experienced each of the previous bosses, yet it feels out of character for the rider, who should arguably feel a much stronger connection with the mothership. I think it would have made more sense to offer the player a choice to move on to the next planet. This would have been easy to transition into a fight anyway. What's probably most interesting about the sense of progression toward the final boss is the lack of progression in the player character himself. All of the abilities present at the end of the game are available right from the start. The sense of progression comes not from leveling up or acquiring new abilities, but the player's personal progression in more adeptly using the tools at his or her disposal. The player feels more powerful, even though nothing has really changed. Here we can see the crux of solid game design. The purpose behind traditional skill and leveling systems is to provide the player with a sense of progression. Furi opts instead to give the player everything from the start, while leveraging its high skill ceiling to build a sense of forward progress anyway. This has a neat side effect of giving the player ownership in their character because everything must be fought for and earned. I especially loved how the rider often fights back during his retry cutscene. It made fights seem all that more achievable. Finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Furi's core gameplay. I think the best way to describe it is that it just fits. It's a bit like putting on an old glove. The parry timings, dashes, ranged attacks, and slashes all feel perfectly balanced and finely tuned. They feel like they just work if used correctly. Furi's core gameplay is so enjoyable that it feels practically unremarkable. It just feels good, without the player having to really think about it. The closest analogy I can strike is the experience of landing a parry in Dark Souls. It's simply a fun and pleasurable experience. In Furi, all combat has that same level of enjoyment. Once again, we see the development team take something rather unremarkable, basic dodges and combat, and polish it into something extraordinary. I think the reason Furi is able to do this so consistently is the iterative process by which the game was designed. The game makers approach the development the same way they approach cooking, adding and removing elements until the overall product met their desired vision. Furi's distinctive art style fits perfectly with the title's narrative and gameplay, giving the game a Japanese samurai-like feel. This congruity is no surprise. The developers collaborated with Takashi Okazaki as he put together designs and modified the gameplay to match. The result is that each boss has a powerful and distinct sense of personality that meshes beautifully with the surrounding environment, sound, and combat. The bosses are certainly great on their own, but their excellence really shines when considered as part of the larger game. It's often a kind of magical experience when the whole is greater than the sum of a game's parts, but I think it's worth mentioning that this statement is also true in reverse. Players have more patience with a strong overall package and are thus more willing to examine the game's singular features in isolation. Conversely, they can refuse to see the good in a game if the overall package is subpar. A good example is the online play of Dark Souls 2, easily the best designed and executed in the series, yet rarely appreciated thanks to the game's myriad flaws. This takes me back to my earlier point about sound design. There's an inherent risk for an artist that their work will be obscured behind bad gameplay. Thankfully, this isn't the case in Furi. The overall package simply works well. Furi is one of the best games I've played this year, and definitely qualifies as something of a sleeper hit for me. The solid sound design, compelling narrative, and remarkable core gameplay combine together into a seriously good experience. The handful of design misses, like manual movement in the path and the odd choice at the end, don't ultimately detract very much from this. Furi, at its core, is simply an extremely fun game to play. For all its excellent design choices, that's what I keep coming back to. It's just a sheer pleasure to experience. That's everything for today. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.